Stop trying to fix a group problem by playing whack-a-mole with individual behavior plans. Today, we are mastering taskless item G.14, group contingencies.
Yeah, because when you operate at the highest level of clinical practice, you just can't rely solely on managing behavior in a vacuum. You have to understand how to architect the environment for an entire collective.
Right. Welcome to the deep dive. And the sources on the table today are, well, they're incredibly robust. We're pulling from the BAS mocks, the Cooper text, and the supervisor's guidebook.
Excellent lineup.
Yeah, and the mission of this deep dive is to really level up your clinical precision on group contingencies so you can walk into the BACB 6th edition exam with absolute clarity. And then, apply these concepts in the field like a top 1% BCBA coach.
Absolutely. No fluff, just the clinical facts and the behavioral mechanics behind them.
Exactly. So let's establish the clinical baseline right away. What are we actually talking about here?
Right. So a group contingency is basically a scenario where a common consequence, usually a reward functioning as a positive reinforcer, is contingent upon the behavior of one member of the group, a part of the group, or everyone in the group.
I like to think of it as like a workplace bonus structure, but engineered with behavioral science instead of corporate guesswork.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah, you aren't just throwing money at a wall and hoping productivity goes up. You're precisely aligning the reward with the target behavior for maximum output.
Right.
But I have to ask, why go through the trouble of designing a group system when we have such effective individual interventions?
Well, honestly, it comes down to treatment integrity and sheer logistics. Imagine one teacher trying to manage 30 different token economies for 30 different kids.
Oh man, that sounds like a nightmare.
It is. You have different tokens, different schedules of reinforcement, different backup reinforcers. It is practically impossible for one human being to implement that with fidelity.
Yeah, the intervention fails, not because the science is wrong, but because the execution is just totally unsustainable.
Exactly. So group contingencies resolve that logistical nightmare. But beyond saving time, they uniquely leverage peer pressure and peer monitoring to change behavior.
So you're essentially turning the learner's peers into your clinical allies.
Spot on, yes.
Okay, so we know what they are, and we know the functional mechanism of why we use them. But what does this actually look like when the rubber meets the road? Let's demand some clinical precision here and examine the 3 specific types, starting with the independent group contingency.
Okay, so the defining characteristic of an independent group contingency is that the contingency is presented to all members of the group, but the reinforcer is only delivered to those specific individuals who actually meet the criteria.
The colloquial phrase to remember here is everyone for themselves.
Yes, everyone for themselves.
So the rule applies to the collective, but your payoff is entirely gated by your own individual performance. If you hit the mark, you get the reward. If the person sitting right next to you fails miserably, well, their failure does not impact your reinforcement at all.
Exactly. Let's look at a real applied ABZ example from the source material.
Let's do it.
So, a special education teacher is struggling with staff management across multiple classrooms. She sets up a contingency where any paraprofessional who is on time to class each day and completes 3 instructional sessions with their students per day will get a $10 coffee gift card on Friday.
Right, and when Friday rolls around, only the paras who hit those specific metrics get the card.
Yep. If Sarah was on time and did her sessions, Sarah gets her coffee.
But if John was late twice, John gets nothing. What's fascinating here is how this maintains individual accountability within a uniform standard.
Exactly. You don't have to write a separate performance improvement plan for Sarah and John. You just run the universal contingency and let their own behavior dictate the outcome.
It's highly effective for environments where you want a blanket standard, but, it doesn't harness the power of peer influence.
No, it doesn't.
To do that, we have to look at the second type, which operates on a completely different behavioral mechanism, the dependent group contingency.
Right, also known in the literature as the hero procedure.
The hero procedure, I love that name.
It's descriptive, right? In a dependent group contingency, the reward for the whole group is dependent on the performance of an individual, or maybe a small group of individuals within that larger group.
Let's unpack this with a real scenario, because this one, it always sounds a bit wild to me.
It can be. Let's look at Anil from BAS Mach 1. He's a high school math teacher, and he is frustrated because his third period class is constantly thrown off track by 2 specific students who just continually interrupt him.
And I'm guessing standard discipline isn't working.
Not at all. He's tried detention, he sent them to the office, called their parents. Nothing works. The functional behavior assessment reveals that the function of their disruption is peer attention.
Ah, of course. Sitting in detention simply doesn't compete with the highly reinforcing value of making 30 other kids laugh.
Exactly. So this is where the clinical strategy comes in. By consulting with a behavior support specialist, Anil implements a dependent group contingency.
Okay, what does he do?
He tells the class that if those two specific troublemakers can keep their interruptions under a certain threshold for the entire period, the entire class gets 15 minutes of free time at the end of the day.
Okay, wait, I have to push back here. Putting the weight of the entire class's free time on the two most disruptive kids, that sounds like a recipe for a total meltdown if they fail.
It does sound risky, right?
Yeah, I mean, the rest of the class is going to turn on them instantly.
You are identifying the exact risk profile of the intervention, which is why it requires such careful clinical judgment. But look at the behavioral mechanism at play here.
Okay.
Under the old system, the peers laughed at the disruptions, right? Which provided immediate positive reinforcement for the maladaptive behavior.
Right.
But under the dependent group contingency, if the entire class knows their free time depends on those two students staying quiet, well, the classmates stop laughing.
Oh, right, because laughing encourages the disruption, which costs them their free time.
Exactly. The peers suddenly have a vested interest in the target student's success. Instead of laughing, they might shush them or whisper encouragement to stay on task.
Wow.
Yeah, the two students still get the peer attention they crave, which addresses the function of their behavior, but now that attention is contingent upon appropriate behavior.
That is top-tier functional thinking right there. You didn't just change the consequence, you changed the behavior of the peers who were unknowingly acting as the reinforcing agents.
Precisely. You flip the contingencies of the entire room without writing 30 different behavior plans.
But I want to hold on to that thought about the risk of failure. In a classroom, maybe you can manage the fallout if the heroes fail. But in a corporate setting, I feel like employees would deeply resent relying on one hero for their bonuses.
Oh, absolutely. They'd probably demand that everyone pulls their own weight or nobody gets paid.
Right.
And that exact organizational dynamic is why we often utilize the third type, which is the interdependent group contingency.
The operative phrase here being all or none.
Yes, all or none. All members of the group must meet the criterion both individually and as a collective for anyone to earn the reward.
So if one person fails, nobody gets the reward. Let's look at how this scales up to organizational behavior management, or OBM.
Yeah, in the supervisor's guidebook, there is a great example addressing high staff absenteeism in a clinic. Management is dealing with a severe issue of staff calling out, particularly for weekend shifts.
Which leaves the clinic understaffed and the remaining employees totally overworked.
Exactly. To combat this, they establish an interdependent group contingency. They set a reasonable criterion for reduced absences across a 4-week period for an entire unit.
Okay, so what's the reward?
The contingency states that if the collective unit meets the attendance criterion, everyone gets assigned fewer weekend shifts in the following rotation.
Okay, but let's dig into the mechanics of that reasonable criterion. If you require 100% perfect attendance from 50 people over a month, one person getting the flu destroys the contingency on day 2.
Oh, definitely.
The motivation for the other 49 people drops to 0 for the rest of the month.
Which is exactly why clinical precision in setting the criterion is paramount. You don't set it at 100%.
What do you do instead?
You set a threshold based on baseline data, say a 20% reduction in overall callouts. If the unit as a whole hits that metric, the interdependent requirement is met.
I see.
And because the consequence affects everyone, it evokes massive peer pressure. The staff members who reliably show up are suddenly highly motivated to hold their frequently absent peers accountable.
Right, maybe offering to help them manage their schedules or just applying social pressure to show up. But anytime you introduce group dynamics and peer pressure into an intervention, things can get incredibly messy. This isn't a sterile laboratory, it's a classroom, or a chaotic clinic, or a high-stress corporate office.
Very true.
What are the clinical traps we really need to avoid when designing these contingencies?
The first and most critical trap, which is highlighted directly in the Cooper text, is skill deficits. You must never use a group contingency if the individuals in the group do not already have the prerequisite skills in their repertoire.
That makes total sense. You can't motivate someone to fly if they don't have wings.
Great way to put it.
If the target behavior requires a skill they haven't mastered, I mean, no amount of peer pressure or promised reward is going to magically install that skill into their brain.
Exactly. It represents a fundamental failure in behavioral design. If a student doesn't have the academic fluency to complete a math worksheet in 10 minutes, or the physiological ability to sit still for an hour, placing an interdependent group contingency on them is disastrous.
Right, because they literally cannot meet the criterion, and now their peers are furious with them for losing the reward.
You must verify through baseline data that the target behavior is a performance deficit, meaning they can do it but won't, and not a skill deficit.
So verify the repertoire before you apply the contingency. But what about trap number 2? Let's talk about the saboteur.
Saboteur.
You always have that one kid in the classroom or that one disgruntled staff member on the unit who figures out that they hold the power to deny everyone else the reinforcer.
Yep.
And frankly, they find watching the world burn more reinforcing than whatever the reward was going to be.
It's a fascinating behavioral phenomenon. When running an interdependent contingency, you are creating a scenario where a single individual has disproportionate control over the environment.
Right.
For some learners, the magnitude of reinforcement they get from peer reactions, the groans, the anger, the attention, far outweighs the value of the programmed reinforcer, like a pizza party or extra recess.
So what's the clinical pivot there? If you have a saboteur actively panking the metric, do you just scrap the whole program? Because if you do, the saboteur just learned that they can completely dismantle the teacher's authority.
You absolutely do not scrap the program. The clinical pivot is to carve the saboteur out of the group metric.
Carve them out. Okay.
You set up a separate individual contingency specifically for them while maintaining the group contingency for everyone else.
I see.
You basically inform the group the contingency is still in effect for the rest of you, but Alex is now on his own individual plan.
Which preserves the effective intervention for the majority while completely removing the saboteur's ability to control the group's reinforcement.
Exactly.
You isolate the variable. That is exactly what an elite behavior analyst does. Trap number 3 comes straight from the supervisor's guidebook, and it circles back to the core mechanism of these interventions, peer pressure.
Right.
We just talked about how peer pressure is the main advantage, but what is the trap?
The trap is unmonitored peer pressure. While peer influence drives the behavior change, supervisors and clinicians lack direct control over how peers actually exert that pressure.
Right. There is a very fine line between, hey man, come on, let's get our work done so we get the pizza, and actual coercion or bullying or threats happening in the hallway or the break room.
Exactly. If the social dynamics are not closely monitored, the peer pressure becomes highly aversive. The intervention might look completely successful on a graph because the target behavior is decreasing, but the collateral social damage is severe.
Wow, yeah.
The clinical takeaway here is that you have to monitor collateral behaviors like negative peer interactions or complaints just as closely as you monitor the data on the primary target behavior.
Let's translate this directly into Pearson VUE logic. For the listener prepping for the board exam right now, I mean, understanding the theory is great, but they need to know how the test writers construct these scenarios.
Absolutely.
Why do they test it the way they do, and how do we navigate it?
Well, the exam writers are testing your ability to discriminate between the locus of the criteria and the locus of the reinforcement. Let's break it down into strict exam strategies.
Perfect.
Strategy 1. Read the scenario and ask yourself who is getting the reward. If the scenario says any individual who meets the criteria gets the reward, or describes a situation where some pass and some fail, but it only affects their own personal outcome, you are looking at an independent group contingency.
Any individual. That is the key word. It's a group rule, but an individual payoff.
Exactly. Now, strategy 2. If the scenario specifically mentions the hero procedure, or it explicitly states that the reward for the entire collective is based on the behavior of one individual or a specific small subgroup, choose dependent.
Okay, so what's the trick to spotting that one?
The key to spotting this on the exam is that the people receiving the reward are not necessarily the ones who had to perform the target behavior.
The group's success depends on the hero.
Got it.
And what's the tell for the third one?
Strategy 3. If the scenario dictates that all members must meet the criterion, or it uses definitive phrases like all or none, or the whole class must average an 80%, choose interdependent.
Okay.
The exam will often try to trick you by using a collective reward, but an individual requirement. Always trace who has to do the work and who gets the payoff.
Trace the work to the payoff.
Yeah.
That is the exact Pearson VUE logic you need to filter these questions through.
Eh.
But, being a top-tier BCBA isn't just about passing the test.
No, it's
You
not.
pass the test to get to the field. So let's get into the advanced clinical application. We spent a lot of time discussing the dark side of peer pressure, the scapegoating, the bullying, the saboteur,
Yeah.
the messy stuff.
How do we engineer the environment to mitigate those negative side effects while keeping the efficiency of the group contingency?
This is where the science gets truly elegant. There is a massive clinical insight detailed in the Cooper text, specifically referencing the work of Poplin and Skinner.
You can drastically increase the effectiveness of a group contingency and simultaneously neutralize negative effects like scapegoating by randomizing the components of the contingency.
Randomizing. How does introducing chaos into an intervention make it more effective? Walk me through what that looks like in practice.
It's not chaos, it's structured unpredictability. Instead of telling the class exactly who gets to do what to earn exactly which reward, you introduce this mystery element.
Like what?
You can randomize the target behavior, you can randomize the reward itself, or, most powerfully, you can randomize the target student.
Wait, let's stop and unpack the behavioral mechanics of that. Let's say you randomize the reward. Instead of saying, if you finish your math, you get 10 minutes of iPad time, you put a question mark on the board.
Exactly.
We call this an establishing operation.
Yeah.
Because they don't know what the prize is, their brain fills in the blank with whatever they currently want most. The mystery actually makes the unknown prize more motivating than if you just told them what it was.
Your analysis of the establishing operation is spot on. Unpredictability momentarily alters the value of the reinforcer.
Wow.
Now, apply that same logic to randomizing the target student. The teacher has an envelope at the front of the room with one student's name inside. The rule is, if the student whose name is in this envelope completes their work by 3 p.m., the whole class gets the mystery reward.
Oh, that is brilliant. The toxic peer pressure drops immediately because there is no specific target to bully. You can't scapegoat someone if you don't know who the hero is supposed to be.
Yes. Furthermore, overall compliance skyrockets.
Or do they all think it might be them?
Exactly. Every single student in that room realizes they might be the one in the envelope. If they slack off and their name gets pulled, they lose the reward for everyone. So everybody works.
That's incredible.
The unpredictability functions as a massive establishing operation, evoking the target behavior across the entire group without singling anyone out. It is a brilliant proactive solution to the problem of coercion and sabotage.
That is exactly what separates a behavioral technician from a true clinician. Understanding the deep mechanics of taskless item, G.14, transforms you from a mere test passer to an elite behavior analyst who can command a classroom, stabilize a chaotic clinic, or restructure incentive contingencies in a corporate boardroom.
It's powerful stuff.
It's not just about memorizing definitions from a textbook. It's about knowing how to architect the environment to set people up for success.
And if we step back and connect this to the macro level, consider how our entire society operates on massive, unwritten group contingencies.
Oh, absolutely.
Think about public health initiatives, tax incentives, or environmental conservation efforts. They are often structured as massive interdependent contingencies.
Right, like if a certain percentage of the population reduces their water usage, the entire city avoids a drought restriction.
Exactly. Or if a community hits a vaccination threshold, the entire population benefits from herd immunity. It really raises a fascinating question to leave you with.
What's that?
How much more effective could our societal structures be if we actively scaled and designed these contingencies using the principles of behavior analysis rather than just leaving them to chance?
And if this helped you follow behavioral intelligence, share this episode with another RBT or BCBA who's studying, and leave a comment or review. That's how we grow. And how I keep creating high-level content for you.
At Amethyst Therapy Services, Inc., we build clinicians, not just test passers. Visit us at www.amethysttherapyservices.com or email info@amethysttherapyservices.com.